So welcome to another video from Twisted Dice. I'm Darren and today I'm going to be taking you through on how I painted up this little lovely lass, the awesome Magus from the Genestealer cult for one of our awesome mega patrons over at Twisted Dice. So a few weeks ago I reached out to one of our patrons and I asked him to choose a character of his choice, of a way of saying thank you for all the awesome support he's given us at Twisted Dice. And Ben's come back and he's chosen the female Magus for the Genestealer cult to go with his army. So this model is an absolutely friggin' awesome, stunning sculpt that Games Workshop have done for the Genestealer cult. Myself, I have two of the male versions and I did look upon getting a female version, but she's always intimidated me with that luscious look upon her face, the legs, the flesh, the bald head. It's been very, very, very intimidating and it's kind of put me off a little bit painting or buying this model to paint up. I always tend to go with models that have got helmets on, so it makes that flesh side a lot easier. But thanks to Ben, he's pushed me in the right direction and he's pushed me to paint a model up that I've always wanted to paint. I really hope you guys and girls enjoy this painting guide as much as I've enjoyed painting her, because she is absolutely friggin' stunning and it's something that I've always wanted to paint but never got around to doing it. So thanks to Ben, hopefully I've done him proud and she is going to be the centerpiece of his army. Please drop some comments down below. Let me know how you get on with this video, whether it's helpful, whether it's not, whether you want me to see extra things me added in. Yeah, feedback is always key and I really do appreciate it. Anyway, if you like the content we're pushing out at Twisted Dice and you want to become a mega boss, just hit that like and subscribe and it helps us out friggin' massive. And we really do appreciate all the support. Anyway, I'm going to say no more. Let's get on with the guide.
This is probably the most important part of the model, priming it up. I like to use a primer through the airbrush so I don't lose any detail. Next step I do is I do a quick zenith highlighting just to make those colours pop once I start adding them to the brush to the model. Now flesh has always been an interesting thing to paint on a model, so these are the colours I'm going to be going with. I'm going to start off with the Budman's Glow, working up to Ivory from Vallejo. Now the purples you can see from the contrast and the shading range, that's what I'm going to add into the recesses and add into the underparts of the flesh tone just to give it a little bit more depth and make it pop a little bit more. First up, I'm going to be going in with the Budman's Glow. Just as Duncan says, make sure you have plenty of thin coats. The more you put on, the more you're going to make this colour pop. So this is a tip that I like to do when painting any miniatures, where I'm going to be applying loads of layers of paint. So using a paper towel or the back of my thumb, before I apply the paint to the model, I'll take off some of the excess paint off the brush itself. So there's a couple of reasons why I do this. One is when applying the paint to the model, my brush is not overloaded, so I'm not going to be having pools and pools of paint pooling up in places where I don't want it to be on the model. Second reason, it allows me to have more control over where the paint is going on the model itself. And of course, having thin layers of paint on the model itself means the paint is going to dry a lot quicker. So this means you're going to get through your models a lot quicker. So those blends are going to be a lot more smoother, a lot more sharper, and the paint's going to dry a lot quicker, meaning you can apply a lot more on in a much shorter time. Kishliff Flesh. As you know, I'm not one for words and I'm definitely not Erebus, but I'm adding this 50-50 to the Cadian Flesh and just applying it to the model where I'm thinking the light will be hitting onto the model. So looking upon the top of the head, all the higher parts of the flesh of the muscles. As I start to build the flesh tone up, I start to add more and more of the lighter flesh tone into the mix. So next up, we're just going to be going in with Kevlish Flesh. Again, keeping that very, very thin, milky consistency. And applying that paint slowly onto the model is really going to help that blend pop very, very nicely on the flesh. And that's what it's all about. Taking it nice and slow to give that nice, rich, fleshy feel. One thing you don't see off camera is I've got a hairdryer just laying down on top of the work surface. So as I'm painting this model, I'm just slowly dipping her into the hot air and that quickly dries that thin layer of paint so I can then apply the next layer quite quickly. So next up, I want to think about the shadow areas of the model itself and giving it a little bit of character, a little bit of depth, a little bit of vibrancy into the shadow. So with a little bit of contrast, adding a drop onto my wet palette, I add a little bit of water and add a little bit of Cadian flesh and turning that paint into more of a glaze, and then slowly adding that paint into the shadow areas of my model. So this is where I'm thinking about putting the shadow in between the eyes, underneath the ears, underneath the chin, underneath the arms, in between the fingers, anywhere around the back of the head. These are the parts I want to think about adding that shade to it. Again, keeping to the same principles as before, keeping the layers thin, means I can put it under the hairdryer and it's going to dry really, really quickly. Now we want to think about pulling those two transitions together. So using the mixture of 50-50 Kevlar flesh with the Cadian flesh, having it nice and thin, I can then start pulling those two paints together, giving that natural blend in between the flesh colours. So next up, we're going to start adding ivory into the mixture. Now we're going to slowly, gradually add this into the wet palette, and the reason why we go for an ivory colour opposed to a white will kind of bleach out the flesh tone, and that's kind of what we don't want. We want a kind of a more of a natural feel. So by adding the ivory into it, it will give you more of a natural glow to the actual flesh itself. So just to give you a little example, as you can see on my palette, I've got the bone separate to the rest of the colours and just adding water into it and then just slowly mixing those colours in. So I've then got a colour palette in between the two different shades. What this also allows me to do, if I go too far with one colour and I want to pull the flesh tone slightly back, this will allow me then to dip into the darker colour to then correct my earlier mistake. So I'm going to start applying this mixture to where I want the highest highlights on the model itself. So as you can see here, I'm aiming for the top part of the thigh, I'm looking upon doing the top part of the head, the top parts of the arm, pretty much where the light would be more saturated on the actual flesh itself. And again, this is really important, don't rush at it, just take couple of different layers onto this, and that will help you have more control over the brush, and it'll help you have more control over the actual blend itself. So I find painting eyeballs difficult at the best of times, but trying to paint it onto camera is even more difficult, and I haven't quite mastered that yet. So let me talk you through what I did. I first painted the eyeballs themselves with ivory. Then with the contrast black, I just put a little dot into the center of the eye, or pretty much where in the direction I want her to be looking at. Now if you get it wrong, as I do many times, all I do is just put the ivory back over the top and then just redo the dot. And then just for the lips, all I've done is gone with a couple of thin layers of Mephiston red just to bring out the richness of the red on the lips. So now this next stage is really important. Now thinking about all the jewelry she has on her, I'm going to be going over with the Balthasar gold and pretty much doing all the golden jewelry straight up. By doing this now means that when I start adding all the reds, the whites, anything like that, I can then paint up to the jewelry itself. I find golds trying to paint in afterwards very, very difficult, and this is for me the best time to start painting gold. As you can see, once the gold's added onto it, it really does help that model pop. And at this point, if you choose, you can start adding some washes into the gold just to give that a little bit more character. So next up, I'm going to start highlighting the gold itself, and as you can see, I've gone with a nice bright gold, and then having a nice thin coat. This allows me then to apply the gold onto the model, and again give that more natural feel on the highlight itself. So next up, I'm going to be starting adding all the black parts into her armor. All I've done with this is gone 50-50 of contrast black with Abaddon black. The Abaddon black just gives the blackness a little bit more richer colour, and it makes it just pop a little bit more on the model. Now once all the black's dry, I'm going to start using some of the Genestealer grey, and I'm going to dry brush this onto parts of the armor of the model. This is going to help pick some of those bits out quite nicely. Now this is a dry brush or a makeup brush that I brought quite cheaply from Tesco's. I brought a set of them for about £9 and they're really good. You've got some really good ends on them. I'm going to get a lot of haters for this, but don't get suckered into buying special brushes for dry brushing, because I find makeup brushes can offer a really good job for a fraction of the price and some of these silly overpriced dry brushes. So just like a lot of dry brushing, just take off a lot of the excess paint off the brush itself before you start applying it. As you can see, in my first attempt I've had a little bit too much on, but corrected that, took a lot more of the paint off, and then just went back in and started carrying on with the dry brushing. As I said, this is going to help pick out those tricky detail parts. To start tidying up the model itself, I started then applying the Genestealer grey to all the parts of the armor. Now because I've done a send-off highlight early on when painting this model, it means that when applying the Genestealer grey, I don't have to go too far down into the recesses because it's already got a natural shade already there. So all I need to do is just water that down and just do a natural blend in between the darker grey to the lighter grey. So applying loads of coats of Genestealer grey onto the top part of our armor or to a hood part will help make this pop, but to do it in loads of different layers and using a damp brush to pull those colours in together will make that really more vibrant and really make it stand out more on the model. To start making that grey pop, I started to add some dead white from Vallejo game colour range, and this slowly added into the mix really did help that grey pop towards the final highlights. So now to make a nice vibrant red cape for her, I went in with some corn red and added a couple of drops of crimson red ink into the mix. Having all the pipes and all the gold parts already pre-painted means that I can push the paintbrush right up underneath those items. As I said earlier on in the video, I find it very difficult to paint in gold after the model has been painted, so I like to do that part early on when painting any of my models. So once the paint is dry, I will go back in with another red coat of paint. This is really going to make that red paint pop, make it more vibrant and make it more stand out upon the model. And this is really what you want. You want to give it a couple of good coats of paint to make that paint really pop out and stand out on your model. So now we want to think about all the shadow areas of the model itself, like where the cloak or the cape meets up to the armor, where the jewelry hangs up off the belt. I added a violet glaze from Games Workshop or the Citadel range, and what I've done, so it's not so thick, I added 50% water into the mix, so making it a very thin glaze. But adding again several coats or several layers onto this, I can get that shade to exactly where I need it to be. So once all the shade is dried, I then went in with Fist in Red, but I also added a couple of drops of the crimson red ink into it as well, just to give it make it a little bit more richer and make it really pop on the model. But again, just like the previous coats, I went in with a very thin layer and then slowly built this up over time. By doing this is really going to help that red pop on your model, and that's what you want. Loads of several coats opposed to one big thick coat, just to make the transitions blend in nicely, but B, to make that colour really pop. And of course that cloak is going to be the thing that's going to stand out the most upon this model. So to help the Mephiston pop on the model itself, I started to add some yellow into the mix. And then just slowly started to add that yellow into the Mephiston to where I wanted it to be. So adding this yellow into the mix will help the red go more to an orangey feel. Now I can keep applying this yellow in there until I get to the right highlight I want for this cape. So the next thing we want to think about tidying up the black parts on the model itself. So the weapon, the boots, around the arm. So using a Baden black and a couple of drops of contrast black, I start to apply that on all the leather parts on the model. And of course that same black was then added to the staff. So this next part, I wanted to show you how the wet palette's going to look in regards to applying the paints onto the model. So by adding a little bit of the fang onto my wet palette, again making it nice and thin, mixing the black and the fang together just to make that black a little bit blacky blue, then adding a little bit of fang separately, again making sure that's more watered down, then doing the same with rust grey, and again exactly the same thing, again making sure that's nice and watery, mixing the two colours together just so then I can pull off any part of that palette. Now to pull this colour up a little bit more for that final highlight, I'm just going to be adding in a little drop of white, and again doing that same process of watering down that white and adding that into rust grey. To help this process speed up in regards in painting, I've got a hairdryer to one side. So what I'm doing is, as I'm laying the first layer of paint on, all I will do then is just drop the model into the path of the hairdryer. That will then quickly dry that first layer of paint. Then that will then allow me to then apply a second layer on in a very, very short period of time. This method really does help speed up your painting process, and it is a really highly recommended technique that I can suggest to anyone that wants to do layer paints and do something at a really high speed. At this point you can see the fang is starting to apply down onto the model. Again, it's still quite thin, it's still quite watery, so once the warm air hits that will then start blending it back into the black. So just like the flesh, all I will start doing then is start pulling into the highest parts of the paint and start building up my layers to start building up the highest highlight up to the edges of the model itself. So now we're getting to the stage of where I'm starting to add the white into the rust grey to start giving those final highlighted parts onto the model itself. Now at this stage, if you go in and you feel that you've gone too bright on the white, or you've gone too bright or too harsh too quickly on any of the highlighted colours, you could just go back in with the previous colour or further darker down that colour wheel that you've already got on your wet palette, and you could then blend those colours in. Again, keeping that nice and thin, more like a glaze effect. You can slowly, subtly pull those colour transitions back in. And as you can see, at the beginning of this, I have gone kind of a bit too harsh on the colours early on, so the colours are quite bright, quite vibrant. So all I will start doing then is working backwards on the darker colours to pull those colours back into black. So next up, we want to start thinking about the gun pouch on her back. So these are going to be the three colours I'm going to be using. So Rockside, Steel Legion Drab, and then back in with that Ivory. Ivory for me is one of those magical colours that help a lot of things pop. And again, just so you can visualize it upon the palette, this is how my palette is going to look with the colors already in pre-preparation on applying that onto the pouch. But just to darken this up just a tad, I'm going to add a little bit of contrast black into this, and that's just going to help that brown just darken up just slightly, so we've got a nice dark brown to start off with. So the blending technique is exactly the same as I did with the boot, other than just using the browns that I've got on the wet palette itself. So for all the dark metals, I use Jet Exhaust from the metal colour range from Vallejo. This is such a beautiful paint in the fact that you can pour it straight from the bottle onto the palette without adding any water or thinners, and it goes nicely onto the model. This is really designed for airbrushing, but it works so well with a brush. And as you can see here, just using a standard brush, it just applies to the model so sweetly. So for when doing the gems on the model itself, I went with a Dark Angels contrast green with moot green, and I also added a little bit of dead white again from Vallejo. So with the gems, I started off dark and then started building up the moot green to the bottom part of the gem to represent where the actual light source will be reflecting from the top part to the bottom part of the gem. When doing things like gems, vials, anything like that, it's always good to use something as a point of reference. So in this case, I used the reference from Games Workshop's original artwork on how they painted this model. This video is probably not a great example on how to do gems, so I will do another one at a later date. For the base on this model, I used the same technique as I did my storage containers. If you haven't really checked it out, there's another painting guide up where you can go and see how I do my storage containers.
And that's it. So I've pretty much spent just under half a day painting this model up. She is so stunning. Using a hairdryer really did help speed this process up. If any tips that I can give you, make sure that you're thinning your paints down quite thin, making sure that you're not applying too much paint onto the model, and a hairdryer really helps speed your painting process up. Hairdryer is key and king. And of course, matte varnish. Woohoo! Don't forget the matte varnish, because matte varnish really does rock. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this. Hopefully, I'll catch you all again on a tactical video, battle report, or even another painting guide. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully, I'll catch you all soon.